Well, welcome to our first ever online Rise Above conference and to this session. And we've got 4 presenters as a part of the session. I will introduce each presenter as it comes their turn, and they will present for approximately 15 minutes. And then we will open up the floor for questions. For those who have questions, you are welcome to unmute yourself when the time comes and just go ahead and ask the question. Or if you'd rather send me a chat, you can do that as well. And so we'll have about 5 minutes for questions before we move on to the next presenter. So we're gonna go ahead and get started, and I wanna introduce our first speaker is Lydia Helton, and she is going to be presenting Heroes and Princesses, How Imagination Can Alleviate Poverty.
Oh. Do I need to be the host to share my screen? Oh, I am the host now. Okay. All right. So my research was called Heroes and Princesses, How Imagination Can Alleviate Poverty. And this was for my Comp 211 research paper with Dr. Edmondson. So our Comp 211 paper was themed imagination. And when you think of imagination, you might think of children, whether it's you're looking back to your own childhood or whether you've worked with children. You probably know that they can have a very vivid imagination. And so what my research looked to do was to look past their imagination as just an envisioning of false worlds and look at it as a source of hope for children in poverty and how they could maybe overcome poverty through that, and then the role of adults in that work. So my research statement was that adults can help children who are living in poverty to utilize imagination as children visualize themselves breaking free from the chains of poverty by employing hard work and resiliency that they can begin to develop early in life. So looking at childhood poverty, the United States Census Bureau found in 2018 that the poverty rate overall was 11.8%. But the poverty rate specifically for children age 18 and under was 16.2%, meaning that children are more likely than adults to be impoverished. And then they also, based on research that I conducted, children that experience poverty in childhood are more likely to be impoverished as adults, contributing to the intergenerational poverty cycle that we often see. What's interesting about childhood poverty is that kids in poverty start with the same goals and dreams that children outside of poverty do. They create all these big goals, but then they realize from a very young age the limitations of their family's means, the extracurricular activities and the opportunities that they may not be able to experience. And so because of this, they lose hope that they may be able to escape poverty through their own efforts. It looks like it's having some technical difficulties. We'll see if it goes in a second. There it goes. So my research contained 3 different avenues of imagination. One of those is the home, another one is through educational systems, and the third one is through communities in general. So beginning in the home, which is where most children's lives starts, especially with parents who potentially are the most influential characters in a child's life. The parents can really influence how children develop imagination. If they have an attitude that there's no way that the life that you're born into can be changed, that they can't get out of the situation that they're in, that can really influence a child's ability to imagine themselves in a different place. So some tangible steps that parents can take to encourage their children to imagine themselves succeeding and getting out of poverty and following their dreams and their goals is to broaden their children's experiences. So expose them to different careers, different possibilities that they can explore with their lives. And then just through that, they start to envision themselves in different places. Through imaginative play, there's a lot of research on how children don't learn through just sitting and talking about their feelings and just expressing all these deep thoughts that they have and listening, but they learn through playing and experiencing and really getting to explore their environment. And so through imaginative play, it doesn't have to be elaborate costumes or props, but parents can really just encourage them to explore and to learn different things that way. And then to read fictional stories and verbally share stories. So reading fictional stories allows children to envision different characters in different scenarios and recognize what are some people that they know that could possibly be put into the story and how their behavior now could affect their future behavior, and start to learn consequential behavior through that. So some of the storytelling work that I was able to research, I think it's going to lag for a second again, was through Molly Salins. And Molly Salins wrote a book about storytelling with children in crisis. She is a family therapist and she's also a social worker. So she has a lot of experience with children from poverty or maybe even through abusive situations or trauma. And so she has learned that storytelling is a way that the children and their family can really overcome that through expressing their emotions and seeing where they may be able to go. So an example of this is a client that she had named Debbie, and she was a young girl who had a traumatic home life growing up until that point, and she was really struggling in school and with her relationships, and storytelling really helped her because she was able to talk about a princess in a story and envision herself as the princess and how she had an inner power to overcome the situation that she was in and turn her situation into something beautiful. And so just that imagery of a princess really changed how she saw her life and what she could succeed in. And so that's one example of how storytelling can help. And then Salins also talked about modeling creativity. So instead of, she would often have her clients draw pictures to represent the stories. And instead of just sitting and watching them draw, she drew alongside them to where they would see that she is vulnerable to even where she didn't have artistic creativity. She was able to draw with them and show them, you know, it's okay to make mistakes and you can turn your mistakes into something beautiful. So without all of this, none of it would really work unless the parent has optimism for their children and what they can succeed in, and then unconditional love. So for the child to realize that they're going to be loved and supported no matter what they end up doing, whether they end up making mistakes or failing, as that's a part of life. And that allows them to step outside of maybe the expectations that society has for them as children in poverty. If they've got, if they're undervaluing what they may be able to succeed in, that way they can step out of that and take some risks and really overcome what they're struggling with. So my next avenue is the education system. So I was able to do a personal interview with Dr. Angie Baker, who is an elementary school principal, and she also has experience teaching and has spent a majority of her career in Title I schools. So she has a lot of experience with children in poverty and how teachers can best help them throughout school. So she talked about how they can model imagination, how they can believe in their students and express that to them to where they realize that they too can succeed. And she talked about how teachers should have an attitude that they may be their only chance out of the situation that they're in if they don't have any support at home. And that can really just help teachers to get in that mindset of helping them as best as they can. They can also appreciate their contributions. Just as a teacher may appreciate the contributions and the insight from a student from another country, children from impoverished backgrounds also have unique perspectives and unique experiences that they can share in class. They can also set high academic expectations for them. Instead of devaluing maybe what they can accomplish or underestimating them, they can set them at the same level and encourage them to persevere even when they fail. They can also supplement the lack of support at home. Oftentimes, impoverished families, the parents don't have as much maybe education to help their children with homework or whatever they need. And then studies also show that children of impoverished families hear on average every day less words than children from higher socioeconomic families do. So because they're hearing less words per day, they're getting less verbal stimulation, they're hearing less vocabulary, and they have less comprehension, less just understanding of putting together sentences and things of that nature, to where they don't really get that support at home. So that can be supplemented at school with different programs. They can also incorporate creative opportunities, whether that's field trips to different places or guest speakers that just come and read to the students, or even come to share their experience in a certain profession that can expose students to a wide variety of careers that they may want to go into and find their passions. And communities is the third avenue. So communities often underestimate the value that impoverished students can bring, and impoverished children, what they can succeed. So they may devalue their education, not support that as much, and they may just underestimate their contributions to society. And so some different ways that they can support them is financially. So whether they're donating to organizations or even just donating backpacks and school supplies that may help students to get like a tangible source of hope that they can look at and think that somebody is supporting them and cares about their education and wants them to succeed. Another one of those is attendance, whether it's art shows or athletic events or school concerts. They're going to support them and showing them that people are there to support them and their efforts and their achievements. That's one of the things Salins talks about too, is when the students make their artwork about their stories and they're able to go and share those and they get praised for their accomplishments, that boosts their self-esteem and self-confidence to where they feel like they can accomplish more. And then role modeling is another inexpensive but very powerful method to where the communities can support these children. They can be role models that have gone out of poverty themselves, or maybe they are in a profession that is a child's dream. So that's just a way that they can show them that they can get from where they are to where they want to be. So some opponents of imagination, this was my counter argument, and that has to do with John Dewey, who is a psychologist and an educational reformer, and he was actually against uncontrolled imagination. He thought it might lead to cynicism, that children wouldn't be able to find pleasure in the world. They shouldn't really use imagination beyond scientific or educational means. And Salins actually addresses this in her book, that for those that think that imagination may cause them to have to bring up all this trauma they've experienced and actually create more instability in their lives, she argues that this unfortunately is their reality every day, that they experience this chaos and this trauma that is just part of their normal life. And so storytelling allows them to express their emotions slowly and create an order and a sequence with it where they can visually see it and visually be able to control it to where they can really succeed with what they want to do. And in conclusion, I'm sure you all have heard of J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter series, but she has a commencement speech for a graduating class that many of you may have heard as well. And she talks about not only the creativity that she had for the whole Harry Potter series and envisioning these fantasy worlds, but she also talks about the power of empathy and how human beings are unique in that we can imagine ourselves in other people's shoes and really look to support them and see maybe what they're going through. And so that's one of the imagination portions of this research, is that we can imagine ourselves in these children's shoes and what they would need to support them through this. And the last quote that I'll leave you with from my research was from Salins' book of a young boy named Saul, and he really struggled to get his homework done because he wanted to make sure everything was right so he didn't have any mistakes and didn't fail. And she worked with him one step at a time, and he eventually overcame that through storytelling. And his quote was, "I try to tell myself that I am something, even if I don't know that yet." Are there any questions?
Again, feel free to just unmute yourself, or Dr. Drennan can unmute you and ask questions, or you can send me a chat as well.
Lydia, I don't think this is really a question that's well formulated. It's really not a question at all, but I kept thinking of The Glass Castle. Have you read that book or seen that movie or heard of it? And, you know, does it resonate with your research at all, what Jeanette went through?
It's been a long time. I think we read it in like 7th or 8th grade maybe. So I haven't read it in a long time, but I need to now that I've done this research, because that's a good point. That falls right with it.
Just makes me think of her family and how they used imagination and how that may have influenced her both for good and for bad.
Right, yeah.
Personally.
Any other questions? I have one. What, for you, as you think about what you learned and just kind of, you're obviously passionate about this, can you see next steps that you personally would like to take with research in this area?
I started with, because I'm interested in occupational therapy. So I started looking at imagination and how that can help maybe individuals with chronic illnesses and how that can maybe impact them, and or even not chronic illnesses, but illnesses in general, and how that maybe would impact how they are able to get well again. So I think that'd be really interesting too. But then as far as just like children in general too, I think it's just neat to realize how much of like little impacts happen, because most of the research was just, you know, the daily little things. And so just looking at that and how impactful that can be just from that standpoint.
That sounds great. And I think it'd be very interesting as you enter into that. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah.
Other questions for Lydia? All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. We are going to move on to Joy. Is it okay, even though it's not 5 point? I mean, or should we wait in case people are coming for Connor?
Yeah, I did just recognize a hiccup that I wasn't aware of, and that is that when I'm not the host, when the speaker's the host, people are in the waiting room and can't get in, and I don't know that they're waiting and can't get in. So you just, I hate to put that on the speaker again, but if the speaker happens to notice somebody waiting, you might want to let them in, unless somebody has a solution to that I'm unaware of. But I'm going to go ahead and make Connor the host at this time so he can share his screen and start presenting.
Okay. Connor, the floor is yours.
All right, well, I guess we'll just get started here. So, if I can get this out of the way so I can see what I'm doing. Great. Okay, so nonprofit versus for-profit microfinance. So here's your disclaimer. This is a case study. I'm going to be examining 2 providers, and the conclusions that I draw can really only pertain to them, and any other conclusions that you choose to draw based on that, know that they only really pertain to them at the least. So overview, I'm going to try and give you a very abbreviated version of what microfinance is, the debate about for-profit versus nonprofit microfinance, and then we're going to examine the 2 providers, a for-profit and a nonprofit, and try and draw some conclusions about their effectiveness. So in its simplest form, microfinance is a form of poverty alleviation that revolves around providing financial services to people that have historically been referred to as unbankable. These people have been referred to as unbankable because these financial institutions don't see a way to profit from interacting with them and offering their services to them. So this is where microfinance providers step in and provide access to capital through small loans and services like checking accounts and things like that for these impoverished people. And the idea behind it is that it improves financial literacy, so that if they do improve their lives to the point that they're able to interact with these larger financial institutions, that they're able to at least have some idea of what's going on there. And microfinance typically focuses on women because the track record has shown that women are more likely to take the capital that they gain from these small loans and put it back into their families, as opposed to men who are less likely to do so. And microfinance aims to be self-sufficient because they will generate some kind of profit from their loans, and in turn they take this profit and roll it back into their microfinance ventures, and this allows them to provide more loans and continue on that way. So as you might expect with just about anything involving money, people looked at it and said, well, you're doing this, you're getting some kind of return for the money that you're lending out. We think we can gain more money. And they step in, put in place a for-profit model. Now, ideally, a microfinance institution will function more as a for-profit in the end, but in the beginning, they would still need to gain some money from the donors just to start providing services. But then eventually the people would ideally be funneling money back into the company, repaying their loans. But each of these models has its own strengths and weaknesses. A for-profit is going to be innately self-sufficient, like you saw in the last slide. The for-profit model is already cyclical, and they're actually able to expand a little more quickly by being able to attract larger investors, because it's a lot easier to get people to give you money when you are going to be returning that money likely with some kind of return than it is to just tell people you're doing good with their money. And for-profit providers are also better able to attract employees and management through competitive compensation packages, which nonprofits are extremely limited on, because there's actually regulation in place limiting the compensation that they can give out due to their tax-free status. Now, nonprofits also have some benefits. Removing profit as a factor allows the firm to be more mission motivated. This is not a good day not to be able to talk. Which allows them to be more ethical and less likely to take advantage of their consumers, because there is no profit incentive there. There's no one outside the company saying, we gave you this startup capital, you told us we would get, say, 15% return, we're only getting 10, you need to increase your interest rates. There's less likelihood of that happening in a nonprofit because there aren't those investors. So Grameen America is going to be the nonprofit provider that we will look at today. They were founded in 2007, and they're the sister bank to Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, which was founded by Muhammad Yunus, who's pretty widely held as the father of microfinance. And that's relevant because they hold true to their sister bank's philosophies, being that for-profit microfinance is essentially theft. It's a pretty hard line, and they draw it because they feel that any extra interest being charged to these people who are already in such dire straits is completely unethical, because it's money they shouldn't have to pay. You should just be doing this good thing because that's your mission. You shouldn't be trying to take advantage of these people and turn a profit. And that's their logo in the background. And on the flip side, we have Compartamos, which is a for-profit microfinance provider, which was originally incorporated in 1990. They were restructured in 2009 because they were found to be charging some kind of absurdly high interest rates, but since then they've regarnered some of the public trust and support by charging lower interest rates and overall acting probably a little more ethically than they had in the past. But they believe, completely contrary to Grameen America, that their for-profit structure will allow them to reach more people more quickly than a nonprofit model would, because they are able to attract more investors that way, because they're able to expand more quickly and more rapidly through being a for-profit than being a nonprofit. So who's correct? It's kind of a hard question to answer outright. Originally, data is pretty hard to find for success measures regarding microfinance providers, because the ideal measure wouldn't be anything financial, which is pretty much what these institutions put out as financial information. It would be how many people went on to be able to lead better lives after they participated in the programs. So I think the ideal measure would probably be the number of people who went on from the programs to be able to secure loans through larger financial institutions, but that would involve tracking them after they moved on from the programs and isn't entirely feasible. So the data just kind of isn't there. But this wouldn't really be much of a project if I just said, hey, the data isn't there, I don't know what to do about it. So I decided to try a few ways of evaluating these to companies relative to each other. Being, first and foremost, I compared their revenues to revenues. So the revenue of Grameen to the revenue of Compartamos, thinking that this would reveal some scale of the companies, and that would be a sort of stand-in for the number of people that they were able to service. Then I looked at operating expenses divided by revenue, the idea here being that it would showcase the ability of the company to actually put revenue into effect because their operating activities would involve their program expenses. So the closer that would be to 100% would be better, but if it went over, that wouldn't be great because then they would be spending more than they were taking in. And then I looked at cash divided by operating expenses to show liquidity, but it actually ended up showing that Grameen was having a bit of an issue with cash. And then I made a few regressions to try and include a few variables that I thought weren't being very well included in these metrics. So revenue comparison, I don't really have a ton to say here. Grameen's revenue is just fractions of a percentage of Compartamos' revenue. They generate so much more revenue, and ideally that would mean that they would be able to serve a lot more people. Now we have effectiveness of revenue dollars being the operating expenses divided by the revenues. So right off the bat, you can probably see in 08, we've got some problems, but there was a recession in that year. And when there's a recession, it's a lot more difficult to get people to donate to a charity because they feel like their way of life is being threatened. They don't know if they're going to be able to continue living like they are. So they're much less likely to donate. So they weren't generating as much revenue. From there, we have Compartamos seeming to be more effective, with the exception of in 2012 than Grameen was, but then they flip it in 2015 and Grameen starts to become more effective than Compartamos, and continuing on moving forward, they have continued to seem more effective. So now we run into Grameen's cash problem. Compartamos seems to do okay with regards to their cash flows, or with regards to their cash compared to their operating expenses, being fairly consistent. And then we look at Grameen's, and for some reason they're holding massive amounts of cash relative to their operating expenses, which is a problem because any cash you're holding isn't being involved in your programs. So it's not really doing anyone that you're trying to help any good because you're just holding on to it. But they do seem to be at least doing a little better in 2018. Well, a lot better if you compare it to 2013 when they had almost 5,000%. But they seem to be doing a little better now, but that cash amount is kind of a problem. So now I have these regression results. I compared this to operating expenses divided by revenues because I felt that was probably the most fair measure of efficiency. And for this regression particularly, I ended up with an R-squared. So the R-squared is the explanatory power of the model of about 97%, which is pretty good, I would think. And I think it's just a reflection of the fact that the business is operating in a manner you would expect the business to be operating in, and that it's self-sufficient. Whereas the results from Grameen were significantly less telling. The R-squared for Grameen was only around 0.47, so the explanatory power was only around 47%, meaning that they don't quite seem to be at that level of self-sufficiency you would expect a for-profit to have, and it seems like there's something else going on there that's driving a lot of their decisions. So overall results, we have Grameen generating a lot more revenue, or we have Compartamos generating a lot more revenue than Grameen, and then operating expenses compared to revenue, Grameen seems to be doing better now than they were previously, and Compartamos seems to be doing about the same. And then we have cash relative to operating expenses. Of course, Grameen was holding way more cash than they needed to be with regards to that. And you just saw the regression results, and it seems like they aren't quite at the place to become self-sufficient that they probably need to be a front runner provider.
Thank you very much, Connor. I would like to open the floor now. If people have questions, feel free to unmute yourself, or Dr. Drennan can unmute you and ask them.
So you mentioned a cash problem with Grameen. Do you have any idea why that might be the case? Seems like a weird way to run a program.
Yeah, I thought it was weird too. I thought it could be because they were a nonprofit, so they could have donor restrictions placed on their cash. But when I dug through their financials, they didn't have, the cash wasn't considered restricted by donor restrictions. And they also didn't disclose anything in their notes to their financials. So I'm not really 100% sure why. I do have one working theory though, and it's that because the relative newness of microfinance, especially in the US, meant they didn't know what regulatory requirements they were going to have to meet with regards to cash as a lender. So they could have been holding on to some for that reason, but 5,000% seems high even for that.
Other questions?
Did that answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry, thank you.
Connor, I know that this is just a case study, and we've talked a lot about that, and it's hard to, you know, one of the things that with microfinance is it's hard to get a hold of the data, or the data. But as you looked at these two organizations, I mean, if you were speculating, do you think you would find similar practices potentially in other nonprofit versus for-profit microfinance organizations? And I know, again, I mean, it's just one case, so we don't want to assume anything, but just from reading and everything else, what do you think, you know, what would kind of your overview analysis be?
I would think, at least in terms of for-profits, I think we would see a lot of similarities between Compartamos and other for-profits. As far as nonprofits go, I'm not entirely sure, because there are a lot of different problems that are faced by providers in the US that aren't faced by providers elsewhere, because there are regulatory problems, and the GDP per capita is a problem, because people would need such larger loans in the US than they do other places to be able to see the same level of improvement.
Great, thanks.
But yeah, I think the framework overall is going to be similar. Give out the loans, try and track the people, try and keep up with everything.
Yeah, and I also think probably in the US, I'm glad you selected them. The data is probably more available here than with a lot of, which is part of the benefit of that.
Yeah, I originally wanted to do the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, but it's just their financials are hard to find. Which is a bit of an understatement, but.
Other questions?
You think the lack of, I guess, a profit expectation on the part of a nonprofit might be a reason why they just aren't concerned about all the cash they have? I mean, they're not really driven to be very efficient with that. It's a non-earning asset just sitting there.
It is. Like I said, I'm not 100% sure why they hold on to that much cash to begin with. That likely does have something to do with it. It could be because they're trying to plan out more. I know they were there was a little bit of an internal confusion that they were having just regarding implementing programs, but they seem to be doing better, at least in 2018, and they recently released their data for 2019 and it's down a little more. So I'm hoping they will continue to do better and continue to get the cash out there to people that need it, or at least they don't work to generate as much. It also could be because there's sort of this hype surrounding microfinance, and they could have just gained a ton of investors in the US and not been able to put that much money to work.
Anyone else? All right, well, thank you, Connor. Good job, appreciate it. All right, well, up next we have Valentina Kenjeres with how does corruption influence overall economic growth?
Valentina, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I will talk about how we use the concepts what we learned in our econometrics class, and I apply them to socioeconomic factors impacting economic growth. Some technical issues. Okay, so I'm sure we will all agree that some social and economic factors can affect the country's overall economic growth. And these factors are political stability, employment rate, the economic status of the country, corruption, and I'll focus more on corruption because corruption has a negative influence on the country's economic growth, so the overall gross domestic product. So I started this data collection, and I actually collected data for over 200 countries. However, I was only available to get data for 169 countries that had all the data available what I needed. I gathered these data from publicly available websites such as the World Bank and its affiliated sites. And for the corruption perception index, I got it from the Transparency Index website. And the corruption score goes from 100 to 0, and 100 means the least corrupt. And all the data are from 2018. And for GDP per capita, I needed the data for 2017 as well. So in my first model, I just wanted to see how the previous year's GDP affects the country's next year's GDP. So I ran a regression, and I used the GDP 2018 as my dependent variable and GDP 2017 as my independent variable. And the results are below that. The R square is close to 1, and the R square it's between 0 and 1. And if it's closer to 1, it means there's a strong correlation. So mine is pretty close. And the low p-value, the probability value, indicates that this model is statistically significant. And if the numbers are not enough, here is the pretty picture of the actual GDP and the predicted GDP. And we can see that the predicted GDP values are covering the actual GDP's values in most of the cases. In my next model, my dependent variable was GDP 2018 as well. And for my independent variable, I added one more, which was the corruption perception index. So, and in this model, the R square is a little bit higher than in the previous one, just like slightly bigger. However, and the coefficient for a corruption index was a negative number, which I mentioned earlier, that if it's closer to 100, it means it's least corrupt, so it's negative, so it's pretty bad. But the p-value was greater than 0.05, which means that corruption is not statistically significant enough. In my next model, I added political stability as my third independent variable next to corruption and GDP 2017. And in this case, the R-square was even higher than in my previous models. And we can see the negative coefficient for corruption here as well, and the high positive coefficient for the political stability, which is good because if it's higher the number, it means the country is more politically more stable. And the p-values, they are however lower than in my previous model, but they are still not statistically significant enough. So in my next model, due to lack of significance in corruption and political stability, I wanted to see if the economic status affects the GDP at all. And since the economic status is not a quantitative variable, I was able to add one more independent variable, a dummy variable, which has a value of 1 or 0, and it indicates, and it's so the dummy variable indicates the presence or the absence of some factors that could affect the regression. So in this case, that was my 4 independent variable, and the results were very interesting because the R-square is even higher than before. And also we can see that the coefficient for the dummy variable at 455, it means that developed countries do get that extra bump in the GDP compared to the rest of the world. And the p-value for corruption in this model was lower, 0.127. In the previous model, it was like 0.247, which is lower than the previous model, but it's still not below 0.05. So it's not statistically significant enough either. In my next model, I took a step further and I split the countries to developed and developing countries. And I removed the dummy variable. So I just used GDP 2017, corruption, political stability, and I ran 2 regressions, first for the developed countries and then for the developing countries. And what we can see, the R-square is higher for developing countries. So it means there is a stronger correlation between them, and the p-value for developed countries is less than the developing countries. So it means that it does affect the developed countries as well, but it's still not significant enough, but it does play a role impacting the country's economic growth. And in my previous models, I tried to talk about, I tried to predict the previous GDP and to see how corruption affects these factors. And I wanted to experiment and remove the GDP 2017 as my independent variable. And then I just added employment rate just to experiment with more factors. And the results are actually really interesting in this one because my R-square dropped from 0.99 to 0.69, which makes sense because we removed the most effective variable for predicting the country's next year GDP, which was the previous year's GDP. But what we can see that the p-values are the p-values for developed for the p-values. The p-value is actually less. It's actually less than 0.05 for corruption and for the dummy variable as well. So it means that these models are statistically significant. And for the employment participation, it was just above the level where we can consider it statistically significant. So in conclusion, I tried to, with my analysis, I tried to confirm some of the factors that I mentioned previously and their relationships to each other. And we can see that all the independent variables affect economic growth somehow. And the previous year GDP is the biggest predictor of a country's next year GDP. And corruption definitely has a negative impact on economic growth. However, it was not always statistically significant. And the perceived corruption in the country, as well as the economic status developed or developing, it's become more statistically significant in predicting the GDP in the countries. Any questions?
Any questions for Valentina?
So did you do any kind of, did you identify any particular countries that may fall into more corrupt versus less corrupt?
I use the countries all over from the world, and I ran like one regression with only the developed countries and developing countries, and they're like more developing countries for sure. And what's interesting, the least corrupt country is actually Denmark. And the US, Denmark is with a score of 88, and US is a score with 71. And the United States GDP is just a little bit higher than Denmark. So it also tells a lot that corruption plays a role in the GDP.
And the most corrupt country?
It's Zimbabwe. And mostly African countries are really corrupt.
And one more question, and I'll stop asking questions.
Okay.
Who gives you this perception? Where do you find this perception? What is your source?
The World Bank. I got the data from there. Then the Transparency Index. So just basically publicly available websites.
Okay.
And then I try to confirm them in my paper with academic research as well.
Underlying theory of your model. What's the narrative or the mechanism of
I can't really hear.
You're coming in and out.
Uh-oh. What if I get closer?
A little bit better.
What's the mechanism or the narrative by which corruption hurts economic growth? So what's the theory that would explain the results you found?
I still missed like half of it, so I just heard corruption and theory. I'm not sure what the question is.
You want to type it?
Maybe type it in, yeah.
Yeah, well, while he's doing that, I have a question.
Okay.
I know Excel puts limitations on your ability to run panel regressions, cross-sectional time series. Do you think that if you were able to do that and go back further, that the corruption index would be more telling of GDP predictions?
Yes, probably. But I didn't really do any of that, so I'm not sure, but theoretically it should.
right, his question is there. Can't see it.
Yeah, I can't see it either.
As far as theory goes, why does corruption harm economic growth?
What was the question again?
As far as the underlying theory goes, why does corruption harm economic growth?
I think because, like, so by corruption, I mean when the dishonest behavior of people in power. So I think they just take away money, and then instead of creating more jobs and just like focusing on more maybe investment and trade, they just like take that money. I mean, I guess just like the government is like really controlling the economy. What was interesting for me that like China is the most developing, like their economy is the fastest growing economy in the world, and they were ranked the same as Serbia. Their corruption index was 39 and Serbia's was 2. And China is like so much more developed than Serbia's economy. So it's basically just like the corruption and how they controlling the economy.
Any other questions for Valentina? All right, thank you very much. Good job.
Thank you.
All right, we are going to turn the floor or the computer screen over to Joelle, who is going to be presenting on creating freedom, an analysis of the influencers of human freedom in nations. All right, Joelle, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that. Okay. It's been an increasing trend of the past few centuries of human history that one of our main goals is to increase the freedom and well-being of the people around us. This goal has appeared elsewhere in history, but it seems that it's being worked towards right now in a much more collective sense and with greater dedication. In the 19th century, there was widespread emancipation of slaves. They were freed everywhere from Great Britain to the United States to Egypt, Cambodia, and in every other corner of the globe. Throughout America in the same century, women gradually received rights to property and education. That progress was mirrored throughout Europe and in other places at a much slower pace. In Saudi Arabia, women are currently making strides as well, having just received the right to drive. Freedom of religion has been an ongoing battle since practically the beginning of civilization. However, it now exists in much of the modern world in varying degrees. Most citizens of the modern, developed world have it better than anyone else has had it in history. These people are wealthier, more educated, safer, better fed, and yes, freer than anyone else in history has ever been. It's easy for those of us living in such a world to get caught up in the idea that these freedoms are a staple of the modern world, that they exist for everyone. But that's a far cry from the truth. At least it is for now. Progress is being made every day towards a freer world in spite of the occasional backward stumble. In the time of prosperity and freedom that a large portion of the world now inhabits, it's the collective responsibility of all to work towards extending that freedom and prosperity to others. And in order to best accomplish that goal, it's important to understand what creates a free nation. There are plenty of opinions about this. Some say it's the proliferation of Western ideas. Some say Christianity, and others suggest that the West carries oppression with it and should avoid the spread of its own culture. There are a few who claim that cultural origins have no impact on a nation's freedom, and any cultural background can produce a free or unfree state. Others suggest that a lack of freedom is the fault of a specific ideology, such as Islam, Christianity, or capitalism. So, in light of the wide array of ideas, the following research attempts to sort out what broad factors might feed into a free society. A few variables were chosen for this research. The most important is a measure for freedom itself. Since free and unfree are both qualitative and subjective descriptors, either a proxy variable or an index variable is necessary. The study conducted makes use of an index known as the Cato Institute Human Freedom Index. This index awards a number between 0 and 10 every year to each country. A higher number indicates a greater degree of freedom. Several factors go into determining the score that each country receives. These factors include measures taken by the government to protect its citizens, the rights of citizens to practice religion, and so on. The rigorous calculation of the index values make this an excellent, uniform, unbiased variable for quantitative freedom. The dependent variables chosen are geographical location, rural population, and official religion. There are a number of things worth noting about each of these variables. Geographical regions were broken down primarily by continent, with one exception being the Asian Middle East. It is its own variable. The reasoning behind this is that it's very culturally distinct from other parts of Asia. As such, for the purposes of the study, it's more productive to distinguish it from countries such as Taiwan, Japan, and India. Rural population is used as a proxy variable for the level of societal development of a nation. It's been made into a dummy variable in this model. Nations are distinguished between having rural populations above and below 25%. The reasoning behind this is to take into account that certain nations, regardless of level of development, have natural resources that rely on farmed goods more than other nations. The idea here isn't to analyze the impact of farming on a nation's freedom, it's to look at whether or not there's a relationship between development and freedom. As such, dummy variables suit the needs of the model much better. There's only one religion in the model, Islam. There are very few examples of modern countries that have an official religion that isn't Islam, and the few that were able to be included in the study didn't show any kind of significant relationship with freedom. As such, other religions have been omitted from testing. Information was gathered on 65 different countries in an effort to include samples that represented the full array of possible independent variable values. Data was pulled from the Cato Institute as well as from Britannica. This model wound up having more predictive capability than was expected, with an R-squared of 0.68. This means that almost 70% of the variation in levels of freedom between nations can be explained within the variables used in this model. The model has a standard deviation of 0.717, which suggests that given any data point, the model can predict the level of freedom of that nation within 0.717 points on average. For a frame of reference, the difference between how free Canada and France are is about 0.63. Islam as an official religion proved to be the weakest variable in terms of both impact and relevance, though it certainly holds its own. With a p-value of 0.0353, there's only a 3.5% chance that these results would occur in a data set of this size if Islam didn't really have an impact on freedom. This means there's a 96.5% chance that the variable is meaningful. According to its coefficient, a nation with Islam as an official religion drops 0.622 points from its human freedom score, although that value could be impacted heavily by the inclusion of the Middle East as a factor. The collinearity between official religion and geographical region is a concern in the model that is worth some thought. This is a natural side effect of the issues that they are intended to analyze. The purpose of including them is to tease out the nature of the relationship between human freedom and cultural background. Nations within close proximity often have similar cultural roots, including religion. As such, where there is one country with Islam as its official religion, there are likely to be many other countries nearby that are in the same boat. While there aren't many countries with an official religion other than Islam, those that exist tend to be very geographically focused as well. A number of Scandinavian countries still list Christianity as their official religions, though in their case, it most often seems to be in name only, as they tend towards very high freedom scores, and as such likely boast a great deal of religious freedom. Now for geographical location. There were 3 regions that have a verifiable impact on their country's levels of freedom. These are the Asian Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Being a European nation has a strong positive impact, increasing a country's freedom score by 0.869. What's more, it has a p-value of 0.003, meaning there's a 99.7% chance that its place in the model is correct. Being Middle Eastern or African, on the other hand, both have negative impacts on freedom, the Middle East in particular. African countries have scores that are lower by 0.686, while Middle Eastern countries are docked a massive 1.088 points. Given the results of geography and religion, it's reasonable to say that historical, cultural context plays a large role in a nation's freedom. It's impossible to say how much of it is purely religion and how much of it is the other factors that geographical region helps to capture, but it's clear that it's important. Intuitively, this makes a lot of sense to most people. As for religion, the official religion is the ideology held by, at the very least, the people in power. As a result, the decision makers guide their choices with the precepts of that religion. If a particular religious ideology is predisposed to less societal freedoms, then that tendency is going to show up in every country guided by that set of religious ideals. Based on the data, Islam is particularly predisposed to tyranny. This is not to say that Muslims as a monolith are tyrannical. However, there is clear evidence that at least when used as a guiding principle in the foundation of government, Orthodox Islam leads to the revocation of freedoms to an alarming degree. At least in the modern age, there's no evidence that any other religion has the same effect. It's possible that this has little to do with the religions themselves and more to do with the history of the cultural regions that ascribe to them. The history of the Western world is characterized by a struggle for religious freedom largely due to the multifaceted and fractured nature of the Christian church. It's finally reached a point where governments have stopped dictating religions. As such, while there are few officially Christian countries anymore, those that are often offer extensive religious freedoms in spite of it. There are a variety of non-religious cultural elements that could also inform the impact of cultural background on freedom. Aside from being Christian, Europe has a history of valuing individualism and education over birth. This harkens back to the advent of globalism. In an age of world trade and scientific advancement, it was no longer the son of a duke who could turn a profit. It was whoever learned the merchant's trade or made developments in the sciences. Old money stopped being the only road to power and social status a long time ago in the Western world. This, along with a few developments in Christian theology, led Europe to value the individual and grant them freedom. In Africa, on the other hand, there are a number of deeply rooted ideas that stand in the way of freedom. For example, women are traditionally viewed or valued based on how easy they are to marry off. As a result, practices such as polygyny and FGM are not only legal, but encouraged. It isn't clear why some regions share similar levels of freedom and others do not. Asia, North and South America all have no impact on the levels of freedom of nations. There's a chance that some of this is due to those regions having been heavily colonized. It's possible that this colonization by Europe did enough shuffling of the cultures in those areas that they are no longer homogeneous enough or well-rooted enough to have a serious impact on entire regions in the same way. The final indicator of freedom used in the model is level of development. Our proxy variable for this is rural population. This variable proved to have the strongest p-value, all the way down at 0.00011. In other words, there's barely over 0.1% of a chance that this variable isn't relevant. With a coefficient of negative 0.830, this variable indicates a lower freedom index by approaching 1 full point. However, the causal nature of the relationship is unclear. There's a good chance that level of economic development and level of freedom have a very complicated relationship, both impacting each other. Much evidence indicate that higher freedom fosters economic growth, which would lead to lower rural populations, but there's also reason to believe that this effect goes both ways. This was the case in Europe with globalization, as was mentioned before. It was technological development and the increase in the wealth of merchants and other entrepreneurs that helped to foster individual freedoms by creating a sense of value in individuals. Some, including writers for the Mises Institute, suggest that the economic freedoms that lead to greater economic prosperity also lead to social freedoms. They suggest that by increasing the government's need for control and police tools, economic regulation indirectly increases the ability of the government to take away social freedoms with the same means of control. While we can't be sure of the exact nature of the relationship between economic development and human freedom, It seems clear that such a relationship exists and that it's very strong. So what use can all of this information be? It can help show us in what directions we should move globally to foster human freedom. It seems clear that there's something about Islam as a governing ideology that inhibits free nations. As such, it would be productive to encourage large-scale reforms in the Islamic faith. There's been much discussion over the past few years about encouraging Islamic reformism. One example of the striking differences between orthodoxy and reformism is that jihad, the source of many heinous practices in Islamic countries, is interpreted to be about a personal internal struggle in reformism within a Muslim, rather than a war with infidels. In the words of Irshad Manji of the Washington Institute, society should seek out and support budding reformists just as humanist Christians and secularists in 18th century Germany rallied behind reformers of an insular, walled-off Judaism. Muslims must lead the movement for Islamic reform and prepare for the inevitable backlash of Muslim elders and self-appointed community leaders. Their success will also require mainstream backing. It's important to the success of this more humanist new wave Islam for the rest of the world to support its development. Reformist Islam should be held up as a great alternative to the tyranny that currently reigns in the Middle East and in some parts of Africa, rather than as a slightly more palatable offshoot of Orthodox radical Islam. The world cannot hope to remove Islam from the Middle East, nor should it try. One of the tenets of the free world is that people ought to choose their own faith. However, it may be possible to nudge the progress of these ideologies along. If this goal is realized, the Middle East may see a shift towards separation of church and state, and with it, freer societies. Similar ends could be achieved in Africa if economic development is put at the forefront. Right now, one of the detriments to African nations is an effect known as the brain drain. According to a journal article in 2002 by Sumana Sako, about 1/3 of Africa's skilled workers left the continent in the final decades before the turn of the century. These people made their way to the already developed regions such as Europe and North America, and left Africa with a little over half of its former productive capacity. What's more, it seems reasonable to assume that those skilled people who stayed are concentrated in the few areas that are already more developed regions in Africa, such as Tunisia and Algeria. If this is the case, then it leaves the countries at the bottom of the totem pole in an even worse position. Measures suggested by the same article to help correct the issue are largely about increasing opportunity in Africa and opening up the gates to greater economic and political freedoms to give hope for a better future on the African continent to those who would otherwise abandon it. These measures include efforts to increase civil government participation and prioritize hiring local labor in internationally funded development efforts. The world doesn't have a clear idea about how to make these changes happen. There is even something taboo about saying that some cultures are predisposed to oppression and abuse. The idea that cultures of the Syrian people or the people of the Congo or Yemen have dangerous traits that subject people to evils at the hands of their government is deemed insensitive. However, it seems far more insensitive to ignore harsh truths so we can feel better about our own acceptance, leaving those regions to suffer alone without aid. The development, globalized world is in a better position now than it has ever been to fix these problems. If international forces can work together to promote causes such as reformist Islam and quality employment opportunities in underdeveloped countries, then rather than the most developed countries growing freer while the rest remain stagnant, the world might come to a place of developing freer nations in tandem.
Thanks, Joelle. Good job. Questions for Joelle? Feel free to unmute yourself or type them if that's easier. Questions?
So you said one of the most significant variables was the percentage of rural population. Did you use a dummy variable for that, or did you use the actual percentage of the population?
So I used a dummy variable for that, the reason being that there's a lot of variation in rural population between countries of similar levels of development, partly just because of what natural resources are available and what kinds of things they trade. So I'm less concerned with the actual farming itself and more the fact that rural population tends to be a really good predictor of how developed nations are. So as nations develop further, their rural populations tend to decrease by a great deal. So nations below the 25% threshold will tend to be the less developed nations, whereas those below 25% will be the more highly developed nations.
Joelle, is this something you had studied much of before, or what kind of piqued your interest in you going this route?
So I've been into sort of political science and that kind of thing for a few years, and a lot of my reading and research has been in terms of how different countries and different ideologies promote or fail to promote freedoms in their own regions. And it seems very applicable to a world right now where we're very globalized, but at the same time we have a lot of very disparate cultures. And it seems like the world's kind of trying to navigate how to go about allowing people to be free and maintain their culture and their religion while still trying to mitigate the risks of some ideas. And so I figured this might be a good sort of doorway into understanding how all of that could work.
Great, thanks. Question came in, why didn't you use countries that have Christianity as an official religion?
So a few reasons. One of them being that I tried to, and it was not significant at all. The other being that there aren't a lot of them. So a lot of the ones that there are Scandinavian, and like I said, it seems like they're official religion sort of in name only. So they allow a lot of religious freedoms, even though they might officially be Protestant or whatever they might be. Islam was the only official religion for which there were a lot of examples, and it's the only one that really seemed to have an impact.
Other questions? Okay, hold on, we got another one coming in.
I feel like I should clarify, the regression that I showed you was my final draft regression. There were several other regressions that I made and looked at. So when I say it wasn't relevant, what I mean by that is that when I put it in the regression, its p-value was something in excess of like 0.2 or 0.3 or whatever it was.
All right, here comes the other question. Do you think that the specific colonizing power had an influence over freedom? For example, France versus England versus Spain.
Do you mean, do I think that nations that did colonizing had less power? Or do you mean, do I think that nations that were colonized had different levels of freedom?
Hold on, I'll find out the answer.
Okay, sorry.
I could guess what he meant, but I'm not going to do that. What effect did the different powers have on the nations they colonized?
So I actually looked at this very briefly. So it's kind of hard to gather data on this. It's not like there's like indexes of, at least not that I found, of what nations were colonized by who. But I at least tried to accumulate a list of nations that started out or were heavily colonized by England specifically, just because that was one of the biggest colonizing powers in the colonial period for Europe. And it didn't have, it was also irrelevant. So I did a regression with it and it didn't seem to have an impact.
Talked about countries, I think can you hear me? I'm not muted, am I?
Yeah.
Countries that had, say, Islam as the official religion of the country. I guess I'm trying to think of more generally, any country that has an official religion, is that a step away from being free, a country with a high level of freedom versus a country that doesn't have an official religion at all, regardless of what the religion is?
Yeah, so this is something that I thought about whether or not I should include this as a variable or find some other way of looking at it. Something that would be interesting to look at is the effect of non-official religions. I think that would give a more accurate idea. But the reason I feel okay about including it is because it seems like countries with different religions might handle official religions in different ways. So countries that did include Christianity or Hinduism as their official religion seemed like they did so in name only. So I tried official religion in general, and I tried separating it out between Christianity, Islam, and other, and no matter how I broke it down, it seemed like Islam was the only thing that really had an impact. There's also likely a little bit of collinearity here as well, just because the nations that are officially Christian, of which again there are very, very few, but they tend to be focused in Europe, particularly in Scandinavia, and Europe as a whole tends towards very high freedom scores.
Okay, we've got another one come in. Let's see. Sometimes it's helpful to leave a variable in to show that it doesn't have statistical significance. Just a statement from Dr. Campbell.
That's fair.
From the economic professor, I'm sure.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much, Joelle, great job. And I would say thank you to all 4 of our presenters. You all did a wonderful job today, and appreciate you and your hard work. And so yeah, so thanks so much. Joy, is there anything else we need to do as we close from your end?
No, I would just remind them that they can probably still pop into a couple other sessions. Some of them don't end until 6:45 or 6:50, and the faculty lecture will be at 7 if they want to join into that. That's myself and Ted Thomas. We're going to be talking about genocide in the age of COVID-19. So we're going to relate stuff about genocide to the current crisis. So I bet, this is a comment for David Campbell, I bet next year you'll have a bunch of COVID-19 variables in your regressions. You think that's true? So just a guess there that might be the case.
Thank you all very much. Good job.
Oh, great job, Doll.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.